Welcome to the SeraPhiend Podcast. I'm Seraphine Arocha, and this is the first podcast of this series. And I'm so excited because my first guest today is Dr. Auburn Ellis. Hello and welcome.
Hi, thank you so much, Seraphine.
It is so good to sit down and talk to you. Initially, when I was going to have you on, I felt like the conversation was going to have a lot more lightness to it. But because of the state of the world today, I feel like we need to have a real conversation and talk about how it's affecting us, our friendship, our work, our lives, and have a vulnerable conversation. So that's why I wanted to have you today.
Sure.
So Dr. Auburn, she started out on her undergrad at Mizzou, and then she got her master's of an art education at the school, the Art Institute in Illinois, and her doctorate in education at National Louis University in Chicago. Is that correct?
Yes.
All right. So just briefly, so our listeners kind of have an idea of your education when you first started going into your undergrad, into your doctorate, how things changed and fleshed out to what you're actually doing now, and talk a little bit about the educational program that you have online.
Okay, great. First, thank you so much for having me. I'm humbled to be your first guest, right? This is a journey, the great adventure, and we're embarking upon it together. So I love that so much. I started at Mizzou in 2002, and I knew that I wanted to be an artist. I am from Kansas City, Missouri, born and raised, and always worked at the Nelson Atkins Museum of Art, like in high school. And that was a big impact on my life. And just, getting to work with clay for the first time, getting to work with students for the first time, painting, being in a museum environment was important to my upbringing. I would spend my lunches in, the Egyptian galleries and things of that sort. And so I was always very enamored with that world. When I got to Mizzou, I started to kind of go through art history, and all of these things, and didn't really see reflections of myself, right? So if I decide that I want to be this big artist, but I'm not aware that there are any great artists, that are of color, then how can I feel encouraged to kind of proceed into that? So I started to see that as one of the first issues for me. I think that's where everything kind of started.
So you're surrounded by all this art. You're in the Egyptian room, and obviously it's reflected back to you in terms of Africa, Egypt. But then in university, there was nothing taught, correct, in the beginning. How did it become introduced to you, and how did you go about questioning about why it wasn't?
Sure. So I had one African-American professor that really made a big impact on my life. She's still my advisor to this day, and we talk and connect on a lot of different things. And she started to introduce me to not only African-American great artists, but African artists. And so not necessarily looking at things from an American perspective, but from a global perspective, because for art, art is very much a global language. So that's super important. When I started to work with her, I would do the research on my own. So then anytime I was given the choice in another class, I would be presenting on something, of African descent. And that kind of became my trademark. Also, making art relative to our experiences became a big part, especially in my junior and senior year. And then students would kind of start to question, we'd be in critique and people would ask, like, why are you making artwork like that? Well, because it's my experience. This is what I see. And of course, being like one of probably two Black people in that department at that time, that became problematic as well. So just kind of fighting against all those different things and finding the balance between just my own happiness and what's going to embark for my future.
It's so interesting because as I started this podcast, there was such an excitement in me because I wanted to get back to my journalist roots. And I found when I first met you, I had met Auburn doing a podcast for Yoga Pants Gallery, which is a company that we both are heroes for. We had sat down and we had an interview, and I was just asking you about your yoga practice. We're both yoga practitioners. And it was a casual conversation, but it quickly got deep. And I realized that so many women in my life have such beautiful stories. And then when you talked to me about your education, I was just blown away and intimidated. I'll be honest with you. I was really intimidated to the point to where I have all these notes in front of me because for me, I'm in a place of learning. And I knew from the moment I met you, even as a yoga instructor, that I was so curious. Kemetic Yoga. I'd like to talk a little bit about that.
Sure.
I consider myself to be, or I did, an expert on yoga with all of my training. And I soon found out how whitewashed I felt that even my own yoga training was. Talk to me about how you explored Kemetic Yoga, its roots, so our listeners understand, and how you use it in your teaching.
Sure. And I'll just go back to when we did that Yoga Pants Gallery, the interview. It was before COVID, and it was before, this kind of awakening that's happening in our country. And it was uncomfortable for me to have that conversation with you at that time. I still, we were both a little bit timid because it hadn't kind of been open like Pandora's box the way it is now and the way people are really doing the work. So when you're talking about your notes and the things you have in front of you, like you are doing the work, and I applaud you for that. And you are definitely an ally, and that's where it starts, having the information and then applying it and really diving deep to find answers for yourself. So
thank you.
Yes, everything, and that's why we can truly call you a friend also, just side note. Everything kind of derives from a cultural background for me, just because of my experiences and how much it's omitted. So when we start to talk about people of color, what they're asking for right now, just asking for our stories to be told, right? To feel a sense of agency or representation everywhere we go, in the stores that we shop in, or even to have stores, right? If we take it one step further for like food deserts and things of that sort. The clothes that we buy, the corporations that we support. And so for me, approaching every project that I do from a cultural grounding is very important so that people understand what that even means, right? This framework is African-centered, so it's like looking at everything through the eyes of Ethiopia. So my doctoral thesis came through that particular paradigm. So when we're talking about paradigm shifting, we're talking about a lens, looking at things from a different lens or a different framework. And it's making people of color the subject rather than the object of your research, right? And really listening and cueing into those experiences. So that was, my dissertation was about like using art, which I like to call cultural artifacts, right? We were brought here during the transatlantic slave trade. We were stripped from our names, our families, and all of these identifiers, right? All of these agencies, but they could not take the patterns of music and art, yoga even, like, right, we're getting there. You had African-American artists like Edmonia Lewis, who would advertise as a Negro artist so that people would be more inclined to come and see the work. Like, oh my gosh, a Negro can't make art. Like, let's go and see that, And these were like in the 1800s. Henry Tanner was a very prominent painter. So these things were in us, right? They were inherent. And they started to emerge as like dance, music, religion, how religions would start to mix, kind of like Creole culture, things of that sort. It's the diaspora. So diaspora means displacement, right? We're displaced. We're in all these different places, creating new ethnicities, creating new patterns of practice. So we'll fast forward to Kemetic Yoga. That is the cultural framework of yoga. Kemetic Yoga, Kemet is Egypt, and which is in Africa, of course, right? So the Egyptians were doing yoga, but they weren't calling it yoga. It was just what you did with your body, right? So the different postures, I'll say like the basic ones, a sesh pose, sesh 1, 2, and 3 variations. A sesh was the scribe. So if you can imagine sitting in a yoga pose and like, creating hieroglyphs, Or if you go to the museum, they have this boat where every person on the boat is in sesh pose, rowing the boat. And so in order to kind of play around with our bodies, like to hit those reflexology pressure points in the feet, connect with our third eye, that Egyptian eye that we see a lot of times that's mimicked, it really is the shape of our pineal gland in the brain.
Interesting.
And so all of these things were happening there, and it was dispersed, right? Some of it was stolen, some of it was taken out. And so that's what Kemetic Yoga is based on. Just bringing back those patterns of practice. So geometric progression, like when you see Egyptians, what do you think about the artwork? How are they, like their placement of their bodies, you know, very stoic. And so the postures really mimic that, right? Mm-hmm. And the breath is taken in 4 parts. So acknowledging that the breath, or shu, is our main source of sustenance, not food, not water, but merely our breath.
So sesh, the pose, what would it be in I guess my teachings that I had? What would that pose be? Would it?
I think it's easy pose. It's just like seated on the shins.
Like Sukhasana almost. I got you. All right.
Yes, like Sukhasana. Yes.
All right. Interesting. And again, I remember when we spoke, and then I looked at the hieroglyphics. I was like, how did we miss this? Because it's so prominently there. And the more that I am doing the work and reading more, just culturally about the arts, science, so many names have been left out. And especially from my education, I am 43 years old, and I grew up in a school in Wichita for most of my life. And I went to Kansas State University. And I tried to recall who were artists, activists, playwrights. I can't recall except for one. I think the name is, it's like Nasaki. I'm not going to remember it. Nasaki Shenge. I forget the name of it. And I remember being asked my freshman year, and one of the women in my theater class, she was African American, and she needed 3 women to represent the colors of a woman, and there weren't enough colored women in the theater program to represent. And it was an interesting conversation. It was a sensitive conversation because the actual poetry and the words were so sensual, and they were so overtly culturally specific to Black people. Sure. And for me to embody that, I remember just feeling strange, just feeling strange, and just feeling like I wanted to put my best foot forward. And I feel that way now. There's so much that it's so humbling to be in this place, because there's so much we don't know and so much we have to learn. Sure.
And even growing up, like your cultural background, in Wichita.
Yeah.
You were talking about that before.
Yeah. Like it was tough. And I went into some of my diaries, and I had kind of expressed kind of offline and with Dr. Auburn about being someone who is, I'm half Middle Eastern, and I was very proud of that when I was younger, and having the white girls not necessarily want to be friends with me, and then the Black girls not wanting to be friends with me either, and feeling a little bit alone. And then I actually got into a fight with a Black girl, and she kicked my butt in front of everybody, and our lockers were separated, and I was humiliated. And I remember over the COVID, I went through all my old diaries, and I read the words that I wrote about this particular woman, and they weren't kind words, and I was so ashamed. And I know I was only 14 at the time, but I didn't recall until now, and looking at those words I wrote, that how even somebody who likes to claim that she's culturally evolved, that there is racism in me. And it just, I cried in humiliation and trying to understand where it was rooted from. Do you find now, because there's this delicate dance now, because in every text I'm reading that's encouraging me to do the work is asking me, please don't go to your Black friends and ask them to tell you how to deal with this. And I'll get choked up because I've gone to my Black friends and I've tried to figure out how and why and wanting to find the right words. And it's so hard to hold a space, I'm sure, for somebody that you're like, wow, I have to hold this space for you to figure this out. So I guess what I will ask you is that, how are you feeling? How are you feeling through all this? Because you've done a lot and you've been a great friend to me.
Sure. I think it's a little different in my case because this is what I write about. So I am the Black friend to come and ask, you know. And we'll talk a little later about the training that I've launched, you know, in lieu of just a lot of people who have come to me seeking a safe space. Yeah. I've had these uncomfortable conversations with a lot of people in the past couple of weeks, more actually than I've had in my entire life. And I've cut a few people off, you know, because I see how they really feel or think, or if they're actually willing to do the work, as opposed to people who may just be kind of putting the buzzwords out there, you know, for a following or knowing that it's a safe thing to do right now. And then they proceed with their lives kind of the way, you know, they have been living them the entire time. And I think the conversation is complicated because it's not just Black people or African American or whatever nomenclature you'd like to use. It's people of color in general. You know, we're talking about BIPOC, right? Black, Indigenous, more so. My story is like second to theirs, very much so. You know, this was their land. Indigenous people, and then the POC, of course, is just people of color in general, Latinx, and everyone who is seeking for voice. And so I think that my voice is amplified right now because of George Floyd and, you know, Breonna Taylor and all of these other people. It started with Trayvon Martin. I can remember very clearly Trayvon, and I made a piece of artwork with him, like kind of in the middle, collaged around it. And that was around the time where Barack, you know, was just kind of getting in office. And so this is something that we've dealt with not just since then, you know, for 400 years.
Yeah,
Rodney I remember the riots.
Yes, I do too.
I remember the Bronco. Like, I remember all of these things. And LA, when they were showing those photos, I can clearly see like my square TV, right? Because now it's on your flat screen. But I remember that very vividly. And it's almost like you become desensitized to violence at a point, unfortunately, because we just keep seeing it happen over and over, and our hearts are hurt, and we start to make these lists. You know, there shouldn't be a list. So I feel, I don't really know what I feel. I'm taking it one breath at a time. And I think that's when my yoga practice becomes super pertinent, because this is heavy. This is trauma, you know, especially with me being back in Kansas City. I spent 10 years in Chicago, and I was doing the work there, you know, design diversity trainings for a lot of different organizations. And it was a normal thing. People are having the conversations, you know, they're asking you what pronoun you'd like to be, you know, to lead the class. Like, this is a normal thing. And so when I came back to Kansas City, it was almost like taking a few steps back. But now, since, you know, this awakening is happening, it's time to just kind of push forward and have the conversations and get uncomfortable and, you know, see what happens. So I'm not really sure how I feel, I guess, to answer.
So we had talked a little bit about kind of feeling like you felt like on pause when you were here in Kansas City, and then this happened. What can you recall the day that you just felt that tactile shift of like kind of it rattling your cage and you being like, oh wait, I did put my work on pause and I need to push forward with this?
Sure. So I consider myself to be a lifelong learner. So there's never really like a pause. It was a shift. Okay. A shift to yoga, which is a lifelong journey, because I started at 30. Let's talk about, like, we're talking about racism. Let's talk about ageism, right? Yeah. It's a whole nother thing. Yeah. Hadn't moved my body since college, right? So I'm stepping into this yoga studio at 30 and, you know, the girls got their sports bras and I'm like, I've got my pajama pants on. I'm like, I'm not even investing in yoga pants yet. Like, let's see what this is about. The yoga shift really helped me, like, emotionally. Mm-hmm. And I have seen myself grow phenomenally because of how I'm able to access certain parts of my body at this point, right? We keep so much stress in our hips, in our shoulders. If I'm walking around hunched up all day, like, that's contributing to my mental state. Mm-hmm. So having that set of realizations and taking this pause from academia was refreshing. And now I'm like, okay, let's put them together, right? How can we help the yoga community unlearn? And it's key to use the word unlearn, because the majority of the stuff we've learned our whole lives have been wrong, right? Mm-hmm. Unlearn these patterns of practice and create a new action plan and a system for change.
I feel that more than ever. My yoga training went on pause right before COVID-19, and I have 60 hours left. And it felt so wrong to go back into a classroom and meditate for 8 hours and go through the sutras. And it just felt like something was missing. And I feel like yoga in and of itself is such a wonderful gift. But I do believe that moving forward with my own teaching and my own journey in it, I want to incorporate this work in it. Sure. How do you see it changing and evolving in your practice and your teaching?
That's a great question. Pause to think. I think that I've never stopped doing the work. Mm-hmm. I think that I read something yesterday and I'm going to steal it and I loved it. My presence is protest, right? Yeah. My hair is protest. Mm-hmm. Intentionality in the way I live my everyday life. And that's important to me. Mm-hmm. So I'm continuing to do the work. It's a lot more vocal now. It's in print. It's on Eventbrite, right? It's an anti-racism training that you can take for the next 3 months. The content will be fresh every month. And we'll start to dialogue, unpack, and have the difficult conversations and come out with an action plan. And I'm just continuing to kind of move through it. So with this
education that is offered, that you're providing online, can all companies, is it more catered to a health and wellness, mm-hmm. or is it anyone?
It's for humans.
All right.
It is by no means catered to yogis or health and wellness. Mm-hmm. The 3 that are out on Eventbrite right now are for individuals. And then I've also had some companies contact me to cater things specifically for their companies, because going through this process, you want to be able to develop something where when you're done, people know what to do, right? Mm-hmm. So for an individual, that's different than a company that may have 20, 50, or 150 employees. And there's an assessment process where we kind of go through and look at what's happening. And I partner with the individuals to kind of understand where they are coming in, right? You meet people where they are. What are they looking for? And then we create the plan to get there. It's it can't happen in a day. I do offer 1-day trainings or 1 week, or it can be 1 month, or it can be ongoing. Mm. And then especially with larger corporations or larger businesses, not only does there need to be an action plan, but a way for people to be able to communicate when something goes wrong. You know, how do I continue to create that comfortable space for people to be able to speak up and, you know, voice their opinion and then find a solution based on that specific incident?
So when I had the privilege of reading your work for merging art and the educative practice using painting as an approach to developing anti-racist pedagogy. I pronounced that right.
Yeah, you
right?
did.
She did. She was teaching me this week.
Nailed it.
I love it. So one of the quotes that you have in here is, for the most part, racism is everywhere in the educational world, and the educational leaders, the people who play a major role in dismantling it, are not cognizant of its existence. I feel like if we don't start in our schools, that it's almost like an uphill battle with the companies. And I mean, right now you can't start from scratch, but where do you see your work expanding and maybe going into the schools? Are you interested in maybe going into the schools?
Sure, yes. That's part of what I was doing
Yeah.
in Chicago. And my dissertation is literally a guide, the template to creating an African-centered environment for school for every subject matter. And it's 250 pages, you know, of chock full of information written in 2013, right? So we're talking.
I know, which is so crazy when I was looking at
so
just what you were
long ago.
referencing, and I'm like, but it's so long ago, and it
Still relevant.
yeah, very relevant,
Right?
and so interesting because what I loved was there was this focus on finding similarities as opposed to differences. That it's easier to collaborate, leading to this more positive contribution in regards to the development of anti-racist pedagogy. That's literally straight out of your paper, and finding these similarities in a way of kind of easing people into these tough conversations through art. And I thought this was really interesting concept because the words right now are very hard for a lot of people to find, but we have feelings when we see a visual and we hear a sound. And I know for me, seeing George Floyd was hard, but hearing him
Take away the
racked me.
Yeah.
And when I hear music and I hear rage in music and I look at paintings, I mean, your body responds. And I feel like when I read your work, there's no doubt that those stimuluses, if you don't find the words, you will know in your body what your reaction is to it. Is there a way that you found that this, I don't know, that the pros and cons of it, because I literally react in a way to where I'm shaking or I'm crying or I'm speechless, and then I want to find the words, and it's this kind of a dance of you have a reaction to it, but you don't know how to communicate what you're feeling.
Sure.
What have you found in facilitating this in the past, and then now bringing it into your present work? How do you see the possibility of using this within your own work, of the visuals with art? Do you see it coming into your work now?
Very much so. So this would probably be an approach that I would take to more like a corporate or an in-person. So right now, just because of COVID, I am limiting everything to virtual. And I think that art is a global language, right? We all can find some sort of connection. That is a way to kind of ease the pain or ease the confusion, give people a different way to respond. So, you know, we have a lot of different kinds of learners. We have visual learners, auditory, kinesthetic. And I think that my workshops really seek to meet the needs of everyone in all forms. So,
well, I'm excited to see what will unfold in your work. And I am going to be taking your course because I'm fascinated on what you'll bring to the table, what you'll bring to the conversation, especially now. I think that for me, I'm coming to terms with the whole concept of this color blindness that I was taught from high school,
that
college.
in the 90s.
Yeah,
that was a thing.
It was a huge thing, and unlearning that, and how just how complex even that issue is. Because the other thing is that there's this kind of white exceptionalism, I guess, is like, well, I don't see color, I don't need to do the work.
Yeah.
And that is what I've realized for the longest time within myself, is because I had Black friends and I appreciated Black art, Black film, Black music, that there was just no way that I had any feelings in me whatsoever that would put down my fellow brothers and sisters. And I'm like, oh my God, now that I think of those words, I'm like, what came out of my mouth? And it's cringy. I mean, this work is so uncomfortable. It's so uncomfortable to the point that I have to give you a lot of credit for going into a workplace where everyone's ego is in check, right? Everybody wants to be performers, right? Sure. So I'm going to be the best performer in my anti-racism. And trying to break down those walls within the team of who's the biggest anti-racist.
Sure. I hadn't actually thought that far, but wow.
Yeah. I've been going there because there is a part of me that, like I said, I realize I've said I'm a perfectionist. You know, you try to get into your ways of protecting yourself, of being like, well, I'm going to do all the work, you know, before I'm even going to have an opinion. And the other thing is that I don't want to be around confrontational people, and then finding that kind of suppressing even a tone of a conversation by being holier than thou, like I don't raise my voice or I don't get upset. I'm realizing just so wrong, because there are people who are going to have rage, and you're going to have those conversations, and you need to be corrected. You have to have somebody push back. And a lot of times it's going to be in conversations where you're trying something out new and being like, all right, this is what I'm seeing. This is what I'm feeling.
Sure.
And the vulnerability of being wrong time and time again, because I have 43 years of doing things wrong or shaping things wrong up in my head. And again, taking it down brick by brick. When you're going to be going into a room of people who are taking this course, what are your fears about going into it, and what are things you're really looking forward to?
I'm looking forward to, I'll start with that. It's the learning opportunities. In any given situation, when I come in as an adult educator, I am the expert, but we'll put it in quotes, right? Because in a community of learners, or just with humans, we're all going to learn from each other, right? So I'm here to learn as much from your experience as you're here to learn from the material that I'm presenting. And I think if you keep that open, then that's a great place to start with people. So I'm excited to kind of take on just the dismantling process. When you see kind of people's aha moments and help them make those connections, that's what makes my vocation worth it. My fears, I'm not even gonna, I don't have any. I mean, fear is attached to all the wrong feelings for this, right? Yeah. I've done the work for over 10 years. The material is proven to be true by an uproar, literal uproar, and the burning of American cities right now. And so it's something that can't really be put on the back burner anymore. I think my fears were like prior to now, like my fears were writing the dissertation because, oh my gosh, who writes about stuff like this? You know, and then you write it and then you don't get a job because you write things like that. So all the fears have been dissipated. And just graduating and finding out that like less than 6% of African Americans have advanced degrees, you know, or doctorate degrees in the United States. And when you look at the professoriate in the United States, the numbers are even worse, like less than 5%, you know, professors. And so when you go circle all the way back to education, that first thing that you said, you know, my fears have all been burned away because I've burned every bridge. And it's lighting the way right now, you know?
Yeah.
So
I'm amazed too, because I have found that within just some of the things I've been doing in my own life, I had shared with you that I work with Wayside Waifs, and I was looking at our No More Bullying program and thinking deeply about implementing the CRT, the critical race theory, and learning about how we can create a more clear, specific dialogue that applies to every child in that classroom, and that there's no room to read in or to feel that they aren't included in the conversation. And the more I dive into it, the more I'm interested in it. And the more that I'm interested in it, the more I realize how big of a void there is in our educational systems of every child being represented in the conversation, in the actual understanding of just where they come from, their home. It is amazing to me how you know, I looked at the statistic that was, again, it's in 2013, but still I wouldn't think that it would change very much. That, what is it, 6% of the teachers were white Christians that are in our school system teaching white Christians.
60.
60, was it 60%? 60, oh, sorry, not 60. I think, yeah, it's more than that. It's not 60%, 60. That to me just blew my mind. There was like, this is the majority of the people in the classrooms.
Sure.
So going forward, what do you hope to see within our own community in Kansas City in getting a hold of what's been kind of this out of control denial and feeling that we're beyond this, and then also how we can bring people in to positions, like for instance the grassroots law project that's coming out, that is essentially trying to make sure that police, for instance, don't get jobs that are security for universities. And they're bringing in a more diverse group of people to be security, since the police right now need they need some training.
For sure.
They need to be more sensitive to what is going on. What do you think? I guess I'm all over the place with my question, but when you think about what could be done now, what comes to mind first, like right off the top of your head?
The first step is people actually admitting that there is systematic racism. Mm-hmm. The CNN breaking news last night clearly said that, White House advisors don't believe that there's systematic racism. Mm. So if you see that coming from the top office in our country, mm-hmm. then what are other people going to think, And so my training starts from that particular lens or framework. It starts with the conversations, once again, meeting people where they're at. If you don't think that systematic racism exists, then we need to back up and have a whole nother conversation. Mm-hmm. And so my hope just for Kansas City and for people all over the United States is just to start having the conversations and looking at what's happening, looking at what big institutions are actually starting to do. It's kind of scary to me. Like when you hear what the NFL, them speaking out, that's a big deal. NASCAR banning the Confederate flag yesterday, these are unprecedented events. And I'm even sitting at home thinking, well, wow, I'm pleasantly surprised. Yeah. And so if we can start to change some things institutionally, right, it starts with just the confession first of, mm-hmm. whoa, there's a problem here. And I think some of these people are doing it just because their hand is being forced, right? Mm-hmm. Like their card's getting pulled and people are looking and they're losing money and they're losing all of these things. And so there is an opportunity being created with the forced hand. And so I'm just going to slide my foot in, and see what happens. On my less optimistic side, I'm thinking of things like affirmative action from the 90s, and those kind of initiatives that kind of went through to help people of color. And then we look at where we are now and it didn't really do anything. But on my more optimistic side, I'm thinking, people are just tired. There's a new wave, like a new generation. I was born in the 80s. I don't claim to be a millennial at all. Yeah. But these millennials are really out here making a statement that they are tired of this. Yeah. And that was the most amazing thing to me watching the protests. Day one, all day on my TV, looking. I'm like, these are white people. Yeah. Yeah. And for me, I had to take all week to process that. They care. Oh my gosh. Yeah. They are dismantling what's happening. They are speaking out. And that's powerful because the people of color can't be the ones because we're not the ones benefiting from the system. We can't change it. We didn't create it. Mm-hmm. And so we have to be the voices and we have to be the people who kind of bring in the initiatives. We have to be a part of it because we have the authentic lived experience, mm-hmm. right? So you can't base any solution on something that you think is happening. You have to actually talk to the people who it's affecting. Mm-hmm. And so I just hope that those dialogues kind of start and continue to permeate American culture, and we'll see.
Yes, we will see. I realized from the first time I met you to the times that we've interacted to just trying to do this first podcast and my dogs were going crazy and re-sitting down, just how slowing down, listening and learning these skills that, I've learned all my life in journalism now are more important than ever, because now is a chance to listen, to learn, and then have conversations about how to apply, because there's no single path, right. I'm realizing, and there's going to be a lot of stop-starts. And now's not the time to seek this perfect answer. Yeah. Because we're going to get nowhere. We have to get messy with this. We have to be vulnerable with this. We have to have these conversations. Sure. I have to mispronounce words and stumble over thoughts to continue to show up for my friend and my friends that are Black and are Indigenous.
BIPOC, all the things.
All of it.
I literally had an argument with someone on my way over here and had to block someone because the representations that they were putting online, like a hashtag was associating them with an indigenous population, you know. And this is someone that's actually actively making money, you know, off of social media. And so I simply kind of put on this post, are you part of the BIPOC community? You know, your platform is important because of the numbers that you have. And she accused me of attacking her, you know? And I said, well, you're diverting from my question.
Yes.
First of all, by saying that I'm attacking you, you know, and that's not how we move the needle. But, you know, you feel comfortable in whatever you're doing. Like, there's two different things that kind of happen as we have these social media platforms. We can either use them for like our power or our privilege. And so if you just have a lot of people with the same like mind echoing, you know, your sentiments all day, like, oh, this is so beautiful, oh, this is so great, then of course you're not going to think there's anything wrong with what you're doing. But when the one person speaks up and says, hey, I'm uncomfortable with this, actually, can you not advertise for my anti-racist training because of what you're posting here? Like, I don't want you to feel, I know you're going to be upset with me for saying this, but please don't, because that is an alternative message. It's the complete dichotomy of what I'm doing. Yeah. And so that's not, you know, how I want my platform represented. And I felt empowered saying that and then being in the car coming here, right? Because there are people actually doing the work, and that's important to me. And I want to, you know, really stand in that. And I want to be able to help people. Like I told this individual, I said, you know, here's access to my research. Like, you can sign up for my training. Forget what I'm doing. Here's 5 other articles, not written by me, right, that talk about Indigenous voices and why this is even an issue. So I just want people to stay informed, do the work, and live in love.
I love that. And I love you very much. I feel very fortunate that I got to meet you, and especially be able to talk to you and be able to learn from you. For sure. And I want my viewers, my listeners, to be able to take this conversation, maybe think a little deeper, maybe today, God forbid, buy a book, start to learn about some elements of this movement, and just question yourself how you can show up just a little bit better, and realize that it's not once the book is done, your work is done, because it's a life practice, 100%. How can my viewers and listeners get more of you?
Oh, yes. You can follow me on Instagram, Dr._Auburn. And I'm also on Facebook. The name of my consulting company is Studio 5400. And so that's on Facebook, as well as Auburn Aesthetic on Facebook.
I love it.
Yes.
Well, thank you for living boldly, loudly, and just sitting down with me today and allowing me to take my little pony legs as I take the information I'm learning and applying it and allowing me to learn and be kind of this guide to coax me in one direction or the other, because I do believe that we all are on the right path now, finally, of like waking up. And I just hope more and more people, one person at a time, that's how we're going to change. Sure. So
that's how it happens. I'll just make one last point. I saw something the other day that made reference to the slaves and how they were working for something that they would never see. Yeah. And so I put myself in that same mindset as I'm doing the work right now. And I may not get to see the change, but I'm going to be an active part of it and work hard for it. So thank you for the platform, SeraPhiend, right? This is you really being a fiend. Like, yes, you're stirring it up.
Definitely.
And we appreciate it.
Well, thank you for allowing me to have the courage on this first episode to go where I never thought I could. Sure. So, all right. Well, thank you so much for viewing, for listening, for allowing us to be vulnerable on this platform. For sure. We'll see you on our next episode. Thanks a lot.